The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota prairie like a hammer. It was not a slow, creeping cold that gave a man time to prepare his soul and his woodpile. It was a sudden, violent assault, a declaration of war from the sky. The wind did not whistle through the eaves, it screamed, a high, thin sound that frayed the nerves and promised an end to all warmth. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, stole the heat from the heart of the fire, and left a rime of ice on the inside of the window panes. It was a physical presence, an enemy that laid siege to the small, scattered settlements, determined to find every weakness and exploit it without mercy. For the families huddled in their cabins, it was a battle fought with cordwood and wool blankets. The stoves glowed a furious red, consuming oak and ash at an alarming rate, yet the corners of the rooms remained frigid. Water froze in the bucket a few feet from the hearth. To go outside was to risk a frost-bitten lung, a pain like swallowing shattered glass. But the greater fear was not for themselves, it was for the animals. In the barns, the true cost of winter was paid. The barns were crude structures, hastily built from green lumber, full of gaps and drafts. They were little more than wooden shells against a gale that felt like it blew straight from the Arctic Pole. Every morning, the men would trudge through snowdrifts, sculpted into monstrous shapes by the wind, their breath turning to ice on their beards. They would slide open the groaning barn doors to be met with a cold that was somehow deeper and more stagnant than the air outside. They would find a calf, frozen stiff in the hay, a prize sow, dead in her pen. The chickens, huddled together for warmth, would be found as a silent, frozen lump in the corner of the coop. Each loss was a blow, not just to the heart, but to the coming year's survival. That animal was next spring's food, next fall's profit, the difference between meager comfort and outright starvation. The community struggled universally, a shared misery that bound them together. They followed the wisdom they knew: build thick walls, stuff the cracks with mud and straw, and burn more wood. But the winter of 1883 proved that wisdom was not enough. The cold was a thief, and their barns were unlocked doors. Among them lived a woman who watched this annual tragedy with a quiet, observant sorrow. She was a widow, her husband taken by a fever 2 summers prior. He had been an engineer from the old country, a man of books and diagrams, with strange ideas about airflow and thermal mass that the practical men of the prairie found amusing. She was seen as an extension of his oddness, a quiet woman who kept to herself, her hands always busy, but her voice rarely heard. She owned a small plot of land on the edge of the settlement, with a handful of cows, a few pigs, and a flock of chickens. Her own barn was as drafty and useless as any other. The previous winter, she had lost 2 calves and her best milking cow. She had sworn it would not happen again. While the other men spent the autumn reinforcing their existing barns, adding another layer of sod to the walls or chinking the logs with fresh mud, she did something that baffled them all. She tore her old barn down, not piece by piece to be reused, but with a grim determination. She dismantled the entire structure until nothing remained but a flat, frozen patch of earth. The men, passing on the main track, would stop and stare. The builder, a man named Elias Thorne, who had put up half the structures in the county, reined in his horse one afternoon. He was a broad, confident man whose pronouncements on construction were taken as gospel. "Woman," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the thin, cold air. "What madness is this? The first snows are a month away. You'll have no shelter for your stock." She did not stop her work, pausing only to push a stray strand of hair from her face. She was clearing stones from a gentle slope at the back of her property, a place no one would ever think to build. "I am building a new shelter," she said, her voice even and calm. Thorne grunted, a sound of disbelief. "There's no time for a proper build. And what are you doing on this hillside? The ground is solid as iron here. Build on the flat, where the foundation is easy." It was not advice. It was a command disguised as common sense. "The hill is part of the design," she replied, her words precise, as if reciting something she had memorized. "The earth will be 3 of my walls." This was so contrary to every principle of building they knew that Thorne could only laugh. The sound was sharp and dismissive. He was joined by the 2 other men who had stopped with him. They built barns to stand up against the wind, to be tall and proud on the flat land. Digging into the earth was for root cellars and graves. The idea of housing living animals underground was absurd. 3 walls of earth? Thorne scoffed. "You're not building a barn, you're digging a tomb. It will be a damp, dark, frozen hole. Your animals will sicken and die before the first blizzard." She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply picked up another rock and placed it on the growing pile, her movements deliberate and sure. Her silence was more infuriating to them than any argument would have been. It was the silence of someone who believed they knew a secret the rest of the world was too foolish to understand. They saw it as arrogance, the quiet madness of a grieving woman who had spent too much time with her dead husband's strange books. The idea had come from those books. After the last of her animals had frozen, she had spent the long nights of late winter poring over her husband's diagrams. He had filled notebooks with sketches of structures from his homeland, places where the winters were just as fierce, but the people had learned different methods of survival over centuries. She could barely read his technical notes, but the drawings were clear. They showed low, long buildings nestled into the south-facing slopes of hills. They showed thick stone walls and massive earthen roofs covered in sod. They showed diagrams of air currents, with arrows indicating how warm, moist air would rise and be vented out through a small, clever chimney, while fresh, cold air was drawn in low to the floor, warming as it mixed. The central principle was one of elegant simplicity. The barn would have no heat of its own, no stove, no fire. The heat would come from the animals themselves. A single cow, her husband had written, produces as much body heat as a small stove. 10 cows, a dozen pigs, a flock of chickens. Together, they were a furnace. The challenge was not creating heat, but capturing it. A traditional barn was like trying to warm the entire outdoors with a single candle. It was too tall, too drafty, too exposed. The heat rose to the high rafters and vanished through 1,000 cracks in the walls. Her barn would be different. It would be an insulated box, low, tight, and shielded by the constant, steady temperature of the earth itself. The community's skepticism curdled into open mockery. As she spent the precious, shortening days of autumn digging into the hillside with a pickaxe and shovel, the work was backbreaking. The men would call out jokes as they passed. "Found any gold in that hole yet? Better dig it deep, for when the cows freeze solid." The women were kinder, but their pity was almost worse. They would stop by with offerings of bread or soup, their eyes full of a sad concern. They spoke to her in gentle, placating tones, as if she were a child engaged in a hopeless fantasy. They urged her to reconsider, to let the men put up a quick, conventional shed for her. It would be better than nothing, they said. "This will be better than something," she would reply, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw and bleeding. "It will be enough." They shook their heads and walked away, whispering about the stubbornness of grief. They saw a woman lost in a fool's errand, honoring her strange husband's memory by building a monument to his folly. They could not see the quiet confidence in her eyes, the methodical precision in her work. They did not understand that she was not driven by grief, but by a fierce, protective logic. She remembered the sight of the frozen calf, its legs tucked beneath it, as if it were only sleeping. That image was a fire in her belly, a fuel that drove the pickaxe into the frozen soil and lifted stones she would have thought impossible to move. She was not building a memorial. She was building a fortress. She worked alone, from the first gray light of dawn until the last vestiges of twilight faded from the sky. The first task was the excavation. The hillside was a stubborn mix of clay and stone, and each shovelful was a victory. She dug a wide, deep rectangle into the slope, a pit that would become the heart of her barn. The earth she removed was piled carefully nearby, to be used later. The men who had mocked her digging were right about one thing: the work was brutal. Her back ached with a fire that never went out, and her arms felt as heavy as lead. But with each passing day, the shape of her idea began to emerge from the unyielding land. Once the pit was dug, she began laying the foundation and the 3 walls that would be buried in the earth. She used the stones she had cleared, large, flat field stones that she maneuvered into place with levers and rollers, a technique she'd read about in one of the books. She was not a mason, but she was patient. She fit the stones together like a puzzle, filling the gaps with a thick mortar of clay and sand. These 3 walls rose slowly, massively thick, until they were level with the surrounding ground. They were not just walls. They were a heat sink, a thermal battery designed to absorb the warmth of the deep earth and hold it. While she toiled in her earthen pit, the rest of the community was engaged in a frenzy of familiar activity. The rhythmic sound of hammers echoed across the prairie as men nailed fresh boards over the gaps in their barns. The air smelled of wood smoke and fresh-cut pine. Elias Thorne was supervising the construction of a new barn for the wealthiest farmer in the settlement. It was a magnificent structure by their standards, 2 stories tall with a soaring hayloft, built from the best lumber money could buy. It was a monument to the conventional wisdom, a bigger, stronger version of the same design that failed them every year. They saw her solitary labor not just as foolish, but as an insult to their collective knowledge, a quiet rejection of the way things were done. Her work was a stark contrast to theirs. They worked with speed, valuing efficiency over precision. She worked with a slowness that they mistook for incompetence. Every stone was chosen with care, every joint sealed meticulously. When the 3 stone walls were complete, she began to construct the front-facing wall and the roof. This was the only part of the structure made of wood. She used thick, hand-hewn timbers for the frame, salvaged from her old barn. The front wall, facing south to catch the low winter sun, was designed with a few small, well-placed windows that could be covered with thick wooden shutters. The door was her greatest challenge. It needed to be thick, heavy, and perfectly sealed. She spent a week building it, laminating 2 layers of thick planks together and fitting it into its frame with such precision that not a sliver of light could pass through the edges. The most unusual part of the design was the roof. Instead of a high-pitched roof designed to shed snow, hers was low and nearly flat, with only a slight grade. The rafters were heavy beams, placed much closer together than was customary. Once the rafters were in place, she laid a solid deck of thick planks over them. Then came the part that truly cemented her reputation as an eccentric. She covered the entire wooden roof with a layer of thick, oiled hide to act as a waterproof membrane. After that, she began to move the mountain of earth she had excavated, painstakingly hauling it bucket by bucket and spreading it over the roof until it was covered by 2 feet of packed soil. Thorne rode by again, this time drawn by the sheer spectacle. He watched as she planted the roof with the tough, native prairie grasses she had carefully dug up and set aside. "You've gone completely mad," he stated, not as an insult, but as a simple observation of fact. The first heavy snow will collapse that roof and kill everything inside. It's a deadfall trap of your own making. The weight of the snow will be insulation, she said, not looking at him. The earth and the snow will be its blanket. Inside, the space was dark and cavernous, smelling of damp earth and fresh-cut wood. It was not large, just big enough for her few animals. The ceiling was low, barely 7 feet high. A tall man would have to stoop. This was intentional. A high ceiling was wasted space, a volume of air that had to be heated. By keeping the ceiling low, the radiant heat from the animals' bodies would be concentrated where it was needed. In the center of the ceiling, she constructed a small, square wooden flue, a ventilation shaft that rose up through the earthen roof. It was fitted with a simple wooden slide that allowed her to control the size of the opening, regulating the flow of air. This was the barn's only lung, the key to removing the excess moisture and ammonia from the animal's breath and waste without losing all the precious heat. It was a delicate balance, and it was the part of the design that had to be perfect. The final detail was the floor. It was not wood, which would rot, nor was it the bare earth, which would turn to a muddy, frozen mess. She laid down a deep bed of sand for drainage, and over that, a thick 6-inch layer of straw. This bedding would not only keep the animals dry and comfortable, but as it composted with their manure throughout the winter, it would generate its own gentle, steady heat from below. The entire structure was a closed system, a living machine designed to capture and recycle every possible unit of warmth. It was a barn built not of wood and nails, but of principles. She finished the last of her work just as the first snowflakes began to fall. They were fat, wet flakes that melted on the tongue, a gentle prelude to the fury that was to come. She led her animals into their new home. The 2 cows, the 4 pigs, the dozen chickens in their enclosed roosting boxes. They entered the dark, quiet space cautiously at first, then settled into their pens with a sense of calm. The air was still and cool, but it lacked the sharp, biting edge of the wind outside. She slid the massive wooden door shut, dropped the heavy bar into place, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of rest. Her work was done. Now, the test would begin. The winter of 1883 did not just arrive. It fell from the sky in a solid white wall. The gentle snows of November gave way to the howling blizzards of December. The wind came first, a relentless, shrieking force that scoured the prairie, picking up the loose snow and turning the air into a blinding, churning chaos. For days, the sun was just a memory, a pale, milky smudge behind a gray sky. Then the temperature plummeted. It dropped past 0, past 10 below, past 20 below, settling into a deep, predatory cold that seemed to suck the very life out of the world. The settlers called it the Great White Death, a storm that was not a storm, but a season unto itself. In the cabins, families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly. The wood piles, which had seemed so large in October, dwindled with terrifying speed. The very act of survival became a monotonous, exhausting labor. The real crisis, however, was happening in the barns. The wind, like 1,000 sharp knives, found every crack and crevice in the wooden walls. It drove the fine, powdery snow through the gaps, dusting the interiors with a layer of white. The animals, their coats thick with frost, shivered uncontrollably. The water in their troughs froze solid within an hour of being filled. The men fought a losing battle. They nailed blankets over the barn doors, stuffed straw into the cracks until their fingers were numb. But it was like trying to patch a sieve. The cold was an invading army, and their defenses were paper-thin. Elias Thorne's magnificent new barn, the pride of the settlement, was failing as badly as the rest. Its tall walls acted like a sail in the wind, groaning and shuddering under the assault. Its vast interior volume was impossible to warm. The farmer who owned it lost 3 of his expensive new cattle in the first week of the storm. Desperate, some men tried to bring the most vulnerable animals, newborn calves, prize pigs, into their own cabins, creating a chaotic, crowded misery for man and beast alike. The suffering was immense. The lowing of cold, hungry cattle was a constant, mournful sound, barely audible over the scream of the wind. The community was trapped, isolated not only from the outside world, but from each other. To cross the 100 yards between one cabin and the next was a life-threatening expedition. They were small islands of flickering warmth in a vast, frozen ocean. And in their shared misery, many of them thought of the widow and her foolish barn of earth. They imagined the scene with a grim, pitying certainty. The earthen roof, heavy with a mountain of snow, would have surely collapsed. If not, the interior would be a frozen cave, her animals long dead. It was a sad, inevitable conclusion to her folly. But inside the widow's barn, a different reality was unfolding. Outside, the wind shrieked and howled, a sound of pure violence. But the sound did not penetrate the thick stone and earth walls. The wind simply flowed over the low, aerodynamic curve of the buried structure, its fury spent on the empty air above. The massive drifts of snow that buried the barn on 3 sides were not a threat. They were a blessing. The snow was a fluffy, perfect insulator, adding another thick blanket to the one she had already built. Inside, the air was still. The darkness was near total, broken only by the faint light from a single lantern she had left hanging, its flame burning low and steady. The air was thick with the warm, earthy smell of animals and hay. It was not the clean, dry heat of a stove, but a damp, living warmth. The temperature hovered at a steady 40 degrees. While the world outside was 40 below, inside this earthen sanctuary, it was 80 degrees warmer. There was no fire. There was only the slow, constant furnace of living bodies. The animals were calm, their breathing slow and regular. The cows lay peacefully chewing their cud. The pigs snuffled contentedly in their deep straw bedding. The chickens roosted quietly, their heads tucked under their wings. The water in their troughs was cool, but it was not frozen. Frost did not creep across the stone walls. The heat radiated by the animals was absorbed by the immense thermal mass of the stone and earth, which then radiated it slowly back, creating a stable, even temperature. She checked on them twice a day, her trips from the cabin short, brutal sprints through the blizzard. Each time she slid open the heavy door, she was met not by a blast of Arctic air, but by a gentle wave of warmth and life. It worked. The diagrams had been true. The principle was sound. The great storm raged for 9 days. When it finally broke, the world was transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun shone on a landscape of pure, sculpted white. The silence was as profound as the noise had been. But the respite from the wind only revealed the true depth of the cold. The temperature remained at a life-threatening 30 below. It was in this cruel, beautiful stillness that the full accounting of the storm's toll began. The news traveled slowly, man to man, a litany of loss. One had lost his entire flock of sheep, another half his herd of cattle. The community's breeding stock, the foundation of its future, had been decimated. There was a pall of grief and despair over the settlement. They had fought the winter with all the strength and knowledge they possessed, and they had lost. It was Elias Thorne who thought of the widow first. He was not a cruel man, merely a proud one, certain in his own expertise. His pride had taken a beating. The barn he had built, the one he had declared the finest in the territory, was now a frozen tomb for a dozen animals. The owner had confronted him, his face a mask of fury and grief. Thorne felt the failure personally. As he surveyed the devastation, a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps a need to see his own grim predictions confirmed, made him pull on his heavy coat and walk toward the widow's land. He saw the barn, or rather, where the barn should be. All that was visible was a smooth, white mound, a drift indistinguishable from any other, with only the small square of the ventilation flue poking through the snow. He saw no tracks leading to or from it, save for a single, faint path from her cabin. He assumed the worst. He walked to the front of the mound, where he knew the door should be, and began to dig. The snow was light and powdery, and he cleared a path to the heavy wooden door in a few minutes. He half expected it to be frozen shut. He pulled on the handle. It swung inward with a quiet groan. The stark contrast between the world outside and the world within was a physical shock. He stepped from a world of blinding white light and air so cold it burned his lungs into a space of soft darkness and gentle, humid warmth. The air that washed over him was not just warm, it was alive. It smelled of hay and animals, the primal scent of life. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim light. He saw the cows, standing and looking at him with placid curiosity. He saw the pigs, snorting in their deep bedding. He heard the quiet clucking of chickens. None of them were shivering. Their coats were sleek and healthy. There was no frost on their whiskers, no sign of distress. They were not just surviving, they were comfortable. He stood there in the doorway, the brutal cold at his back and the impossible warmth on his face, a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been shattered. He saw the thick stone walls, slick with a light condensation but free of ice. He saw the low, heavy ceiling, the deep straw on the floor. He looked for a stove, a fire pit, any source of heat. There was none. He could not comprehend it. It was like stepping into a church and witnessing a miracle. The widow emerged from the shadows at the back of the barn, holding a pitchfork. She was not surprised to see him. She simply looked at him with her calm, steady eyes. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." Thorne was speechless for a long moment. He finally managed to stammer a single, bewildered question. "How?" "The animals keep it warm," she said, her voice as simple and direct as the principle itself. "And the earth holds the warmth in." He stepped fully inside, pulling the door shut behind him, as if to make sure the warmth was not an illusion, a trick of the wind. He ran a bare hand over the stone wall. It was cool to the touch, but not the soul-stealing cold of the stone in his own barn. He looked up at the ventilation flue, seeing the faint plume of steam rising from it into the frigid air outside. He understood then. Not all of it, not the engineering, but the fundamental truth. He had been building against the winter. She had built with it. He had fought the cold. She had captured the warmth. He, the master builder, had constructed a magnificent failure. She, the quiet widow, had built a humble, unshakable success. He was wrong. It was a thought so profound, so utterly foreign to his nature, that it left him dizzy. He did not stay long. He mumbled something, an apology or a word of thanks, he wasn't sure which, and stumbled back out into the blinding cold. The world he re-entered was the same one he had left, but he saw it with entirely new eyes. He saw the folly in the tall, proud barns, their height a monument to wasted heat. He saw the weakness in the thin wooden walls, no matter how well chinked. He saw a generation of wasted effort, of needless loss, all because they had refused to look beyond the wisdom they already knew. Word of what Thorne had seen spread through the settlement like a slow-burning fire. At first it was met with disbelief. It was a trick, some said, a fluke. But the evidence was undeniable. Thorne was the most respected builder among them, and his word carried weight. His shock was genuine, his awe palpable. Slowly, in twos and threes, other men made the pilgrimage to the widow's farm. They came with skepticism in their hearts, but they left with a quiet reverence. Each visitor had the same experience. They would step from the brutal, killing cold into a sanctuary of life. They would stand in the dim, warm air and simply stare, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had always believed to be true. The mockery that had followed the widow for months had vanished, replaced by a profound and humbling respect. The laughter was gone, silenced by the undeniable proof of her wisdom. They saw her not as the crazy widow, but as the woman who had solved the riddle of winter. A few days later, Elias Thorne returned. He did not come to stare. He came with a pencil and a pad of paper in his hand. He found her outside, splitting firewood with a steady, practiced rhythm. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect he had not offered to anyone in years. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and serious, "I was wrong. What I said about your work, I was a prideful fool." She stopped her work and looked at him. "You built with the knowledge you had," she said. It was not a pardon, but a statement of fact. "It was the wrong knowledge," he said. "I've come to ask if you would teach me. Teach me how you did this. I want to understand the principles." He held up the pad and pencil. "I want to learn." That moment was the true turning point. It was the surrender of pride to wisdom, of tradition to innovation. The most vocal skeptic had become the first and most dedicated student. She did not hesitate. She put down her axe and led him back to her small cabin. There she unrolled her late husband's diagrams on the simple wooden table. For hours she explained it all. She pointed to the drawings of thermal mass, explaining how the Earth acts as a battery for heat. She described the importance of the low ceiling and the precise function of the ventilation flue, the delicate balance of retaining warmth while removing moisture. She shared her knowledge as freely and simply as one might share a loaf of bread. She asked for nothing in return. There was no price for her wisdom, no fee for her instruction. The knowledge had been given to her, and she would give it to others. In the following spring, a new sound filled the valley. It was not the sound of hammers on wood, but the scrape of shovels against earth. All over the settlement, men were digging. They were excavating into the south-facing slopes, laying foundations of fieldstone, preparing to build new barns. Elias Thorne was at the center of it, no longer a master builder giving orders, but a collaborator, working alongside his neighbors, sharing the widow's diagrams, which he had painstakingly copied. He explained the principles with the zeal of a new convert. The landscape of the settlement began to change. The tall, vulnerable wooden boxes were replaced by low, sturdy structures, half buried in the earth, their sod roofs waiting for the summer rains to turn them green. The idea spread beyond the confines of their small valley. Travelers passing through would see the strange new barns and ask about their design. The story of the widow who had tamed the winter was told and retold, becoming a piece of local folklore. The plans, copied and recopied, made their way to other settlements, carried by farmers and traders, a quiet revolution of common sense spreading across the prairie. The design was never given a formal name. It was simply called the Warm Barn, or, more often, the Widow's Barn. The woman herself never sought credit or praise. She continued to live her quiet life, tending her farm and her animals. Her greatest satisfaction came not from the respect of her neighbors, but from the simple, profound peace of knowing that her animals were safe. When the winter came again, it was still harsh, still demanding, but it was no longer a terror. It was a challenge that could be met. The sound of suffering from the barns was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that rippled through the entire community. They had learned a lesson that went far beyond the construction of a barn. They learned that the most profound wisdom is often quiet, residing not in the loudest voice, but in the most observant eyes. They discovered that tradition, for all its comfort, can sometimes be a cage, and that true progress requires the humility to admit when the old ways are no longer enough. The harshest winter had taught them their most valuable lesson: that survival depends not on fighting nature with brute force, but on understanding its principles and moving in harmony with them. The widow's barn was more than a building. It was a testament to the enduring power of a single, revolutionary idea, and the quiet courage of the person who dared to build it. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom and unshakable resolve, share it with someone who believes in looking for a better way, even when the old way is all anyone knows. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and the humble strength that changes the world.